What the Western media is celebrating as a diplomatic triumph for Ukraine may actually represent one of the most sophisticated strategic victories Russia has achieved in this entire conflict, and almost no one in the mainstream analysis is willing to acknowledge what just happened. In the last 72 hours, a grain export agreement was finalized that is being portrayed as Ukraine successfully breaking Russia's blockade and securing its economic lifeline. So, the headlines are declaring Ukrainian resilience, European solidarity, and Russian concessions under pressure. But when you actually examine the specific terms of this agreement, when you analyze what Russia extracted in exchange for allowing Ukrainian grain to flow, and when you understand the second and third order effects this deal creates, a completely different picture emerges. I am going to take you inside every dimension of this agreement that the surface level analysis is missing entirely. What are the specific terms that were actually negotiated, and what do they reveal about who had leverage in these negotiations? What did Russia secure in exchange for grain corridor access, and why do those concessions matter far more than the headlines suggest? How does this agreement transform the economic and geopolitical landscape in ways that actually strengthen Russia's position rather than weaken it? And most critically, what does this tell us about the strategic trajectory of this conflict and who is actually winning the long game? There are no comfortable answers for those who have been consuming the narrative that Russia is isolated, weakened, and losing strategic initiative. But the truth, however uncomfortable, is what matters. 4 questions will drive everything that follows. First, what exactly is in this agreement beyond the grain corridor that everyone is focused on? Second, what leverage did each side bring to these negotiations? And what does the outcome tell us about the actual balance of power? Third, what are the cascade effects of this agreement on European energy markets, global food security, and sanctions architecture? And fourth, what does game theory and historical precedent tell us about why Russia would agree to this deal if it was actually losing? By the end of this analysis, you will understand why this grain agreement may be remembered not as the moment Ukraine broke free from Russian pressure, but as the moment Russia secured critical strategic objectives while being praised for making concessions. You will understand why the surface narrative and the structural reality are completely divergent, and why that divergence matters for predicting what happens next. Section 1. The actual terms and what they reveal. Let me start by walking you through what is actually in this agreement, because the media coverage has focused almost entirely on the grain corridor while systematically ignoring the concessions that Russia extracted in exchange for allowing that corridor to operate. The headline provision is straightforward. Ukraine is permitted to export grain through a designated maritime corridor in the Black Sea, with shipments subject to inspection protocols to ensure no weapons or military equipment is being transported. Turkey and the United Nations facilitate the inspections, creating a neutral monitoring mechanism. This allows Ukrainian agricultural exports to reach global markets, preventing the food security crisis that would have resulted from complete blockade. This is the provision that generated all the positive headlines. Ukraine breaks the blockade. Global food crisis averted. Russian isolation deepens as they are forced to allow humanitarian shipments. The narrative writes itself. But now let me tell you what else is in this agreement that received almost no coverage in Western media, but was prominently featured in Russian state media and in the financial press that actually pays attention to commodity markets. Provision 2, significant relaxation of sanctions on Russian Agricultural Bank, which is the primary institution financing Russian grain and fertilizer exports. The bank regains access to SWIFT for agricultural transaction processing. European financial institutions are explicitly authorized to process payments related to Russian agricultural exports without fear of sanctions violations. Provision 3, removal of restrictions on shipping insurance for vessels carrying Russian grain and fertilizer. Western insurance companies, which provide approximately 90% of global maritime insurance, are authorized to cover Russian agricultural shipments. This sounds technical, but it is absolutely critical, because without insurance, ships cannot operate and commodities cannot be transported. Provision 4, explicit recognition that sanctions do not apply to Russian fertilizer exports, with streamlined customs procedures in European ports to facilitate rapid processing of Russian fertilizer shipments. This removes the bureaucratic obstacles that had been functioning as de facto sanctions even when fertilizer was theoretically exempted. Provision 5, a side agreement on ammonia pipeline restoration, allowing Russian ammonia exports to flow through Ukrainian territory to a Black Sea terminal, with transit fees paid to Ukraine, but the commodity exported and monetized by Russia. Now, let me explain why these provisions matter enormously and why their inclusion in the agreement tells you everything about who actually had leverage in these negotiations. Russia is the world's largest exporter of fertilizer and the second largest exporter of grain after the United States. Russian fertilizer exports in 2021 totaled approximately $12 billion. Russian grain exports totaled approximately $9 billion. Ukraine's grain exports totaled approximately $7 billion. The sanctions regime that was imposed on Russia after February 2022 theoretically exempted food and fertilizer to avoid creating global humanitarian crisis. But in practice, the financial sanctions on Russian banks, the restrictions on shipping insurance, the complexity of navigating sanctions compliance, and the political pressure on companies not to do business with Russia created massive obstacles to Russian agricultural exports. Russian grain and fertilizer shipments in the 6 months following sanctions imposition dropped by approximately 40 to 50% compared to the previous year. This was not because Russia could not produce these commodities. Russia had record grain harvests. This was because the financial and logistical infrastructure for exporting these commodities had been crippled by the sanctions architecture. So Russia was sitting on enormous stockpiles of grain and fertilizer that it could not monetize effectively. Ukraine was sitting on grain that it could not export because of Russian naval blockade. Both sides had agricultural commodities they wanted to sell to global markets but faced obstacles to doing so. The question is, who had more leverage in negotiations to remove those obstacles? The conventional analysis says Ukraine had leverage because global food security depended on Ukrainian grain exports, particularly wheat that feeds populations across the Middle East and Africa. Russia would face international condemnation and pressure from developing nations if it maintained a blockade that triggered food crisis and famine. But look at what actually happened in the negotiations. Ukraine got access to export its grain, which it desperately needed for economic survival. But Russia got comprehensive dismantling of the sanctions architecture that had been blocking Russian agricultural exports, plus explicit international recognition that Russian agricultural trade is legitimate and should be facilitated. The asymmetry is stark. Ukraine got permission to do something that was being physically blocked. Russia got systemic changes to the international financial and regulatory framework that apply far beyond this specific agreement. Let me put this in concrete terms. Ukrainian grain exports might total $7 billion per year. The provisions Russia secured enable potentially $20 billion in Russian grain and fertilizer exports that were being blocked by sanctions infrastructure. So Wartsi Chiu Tentar. Russia monetized its negotiating position at roughly 3-to-1 return compared to what Ukraine secured. Moreover, the precedent established by explicitly carving out Russian Agricultural Bank from sanctions, authorizing insurance for Russian shipments, and streamlining customs for Russian exports creates template for future sanctions erosion. If agricultural trade is exempted with full financial infrastructure support, why not other categories of trade? The principle of humanitarian exemption has been established, and the bureaucratic mechanisms for processing Russian transactions have been restored. This is why I describe this as a potential strategic victory for Russia disguised as a concession. Russia agreed to allow Ukrainian grain shipments, which costs Russia nothing since it cannot use that grain anyway, and gains international goodwill for humanitarian gesture. In exchange, Russia secured comprehensive dismantling of sanctions architecture affecting tens of billions of dollars in Russian exports, plus precedent for future sanctions erosion. The fact that Western media portrayed this as Ukrainian victory and Russian concession tells you everything about the sophistication of Russian negotiating strategy and the superficiality of mainstream conflict analysis. Section 2. The leverage dynamics and power asymmetry. Now let me examine the leverage dynamics that produced this outcome, because understanding who actually had power in these negotiations reveals fundamental truths about the strategic balance in this conflict that contradict the prevailing narrative. The conventional wisdom is that Russia is isolated, economically crippled by sanctions, and desperate for any diplomatic wins it can secure. Under this framework, allowing Ukrainian grain exports represents Russia buckling under international pressure and making concessions from weakness. But let me walk you through the actual leverage positions, and you tell me who was negotiating from strength. Ukraine's position. Grain exports represent approximately 10% of Ukrainian GDP and roughly 40% of agricultural sector revenue. The inability to export grain means economic catastrophe. Ukrainian government revenues collapse, ability to pay government employees and military evaporates, and agricultural sector bankruptcies cascade through the rural economy. Ukraine faces immediate existential economic crisis without grain exports. Moreover, Ukrainian grain sitting in silos cannot be stored indefinitely. Grain degrades over time, particularly in hot climates. Storage capacity is finite. If 2022 harvest cannot be exported, there is nowhere to put 2023 harvest. Ukrainian agriculture faces complete collapse within one growing season without export access. The time pressure on Ukraine was acute and absolute. Every week without grain exports moved Ukraine closer to economic system failure. This is not hyperbole. This is mechanical consequence of the numbers. Russia's position, Russian grain and fertilizer exports had been reduced by sanctions infrastructure, but not eliminated. Russia was still exporting significant volumes to countries willing to navigate the complexity. More importantly, Russia's domestic economy is not dependent on grain export revenue the way Ukraine's is. Grain and fertilizer exports represent less than 2% of Russian GDP. Russia could afford to wait. Russian grain could be stored, diverted to domestic consumption, or exported through alternative channels at reduced efficiency. It was not optimal, but it was manageable. Russia faced inconvenience, not existential threat. Now layer in the geopolitical dimension. Every week that Ukrainian grain remained blocked, food prices in global markets increased. Wheat prices surged 40 to 60% above pre-conflict levels. Cooking oil prices doubled. These price increases created acute pressure on developing nations that depend on imported grain. Egypt, which sources approximately 60% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine, faced bread crisis. Tunisia, Lebanon, Yemen, multiple nations across the Middle East and Africa faced food security emergencies. These nations began putting enormous pressure on Western governments and international institutions to resolve the grain crisis. Here's where Russian leverage becomes clear. Russia could credibly claim that it was willing to allow grain shipments, but that Western sanctions were preventing the broader agricultural trade that would stabilize global food markets. As long as Russian fertilizer could not be exported efficiently due to sanctions infrastructure, global fertilizer prices would remain elevated, reducing agricultural production globally and worsening food security. Russia was positioned as both the problem and the solution. Block Ukrainian grain exports and blame sanctions for preventing Russian agricultural trade. Then offer to resolve both issues simultaneously through a comprehensive agreement that unblocks Ukrainian grain while dismantling sanctions on Russian agricultural exports. The developing nations facing food crisis did not care about Western geopolitical objectives regarding Russian isolation. They cared about feeding their populations. They became a pressure vector on Western governments to make whatever concessions were necessary to resolve the grain crisis. This is textbook negotiating leverage. Create a crisis that affects third parties. Position yourself as willing to resolve the crisis if your demands are met. Allow the third parties to pressure your opponent into concessions. Then magnanimously agree to a solution that gives you most of what you wanted while framing it as humanitarian gesture. The Western negotiators walked into this dynamic and either did not recognize it or felt they had no choice but to accept it given the political pressure from developing nations and the economic pressure on Ukraine. Look at the timeline. Negotiations began in May 2022. Agreement was reached in July 2022. That is 8 weeks of negotiations. In diplomatic terms, that is extraordinarily fast for an agreement of this complexity. Fast negotiations typically indicate that one side had overwhelming leverage and the other side faced such acute time pressure that they had to accept unfavorable terms. If Ukraine and its Western backers had genuine leverage, they would have stretched negotiations over months to extract better terms. The fact that agreement came quickly tells you who needed the deal more urgently. Now, let me address the counter-argument that Russia's willingness to negotiate at all demonstrates that sanctions were working and Russia was feeling economic pressure. This argument confuses tactics with strategy. Yes, Russia wanted to restore its agricultural export revenue. But Russia achieved that objective through negotiations while also establishing precedent for sanctions erosion and gaining international recognition of the legitimacy of Russian trade. Russia traded a tactical concession, allowing Ukrainian grain shipments that it could not prevent indefinitely anyway for strategic gains in sanctions architecture dismantling. This is the essence of strategic thinking. Give up things that cost you little to secure things that benefit you enormously. Russia gave up the ability to blockade Ukrainian grain, which was generating international condemnation and providing zero economic benefit. Russia secured comprehensive removal of sanctions infrastructure affecting Russian agricultural trade, worth tens of billions annually, plus precedent for future sanctions negotiations. The leverage asymmetry was complete. Ukraine needed the deal for economic survival. Russia wanted the deal for revenue optimization but could survive without it. Third parties pressured Western negotiators to make concessions to resolve humanitarian crisis. Russia achieved better terms than the surface narrative suggests. Section 3. The cascade effects on European energy and sanctions architecture. Let me explain the second and third order effects of this agreement that extend far beyond grain shipments, because this is where the strategic implications become truly significant. The grain agreement establishes a critical precedent. Sanctions can be negotiated away when humanitarian concerns are invoked, and Russia has veto power over whether those negotiations succeed. This precedent will now be applied to other commodity categories, starting with energy. Here is the cascade logic. If Russian agricultural exports are exempted from sanctions with full financial infrastructure support because food security is a humanitarian concern, then Russian energy exports should be exempted with full financial infrastructure support because energy security is also a humanitarian concern. European nations are already experiencing this dynamic. Germany faces industrial shutdowns due to natural gas shortages. Italy faces electricity rationing. Energy prices across Europe have surged 200 to 300% compared to pre-conflict levels. This is creating acute economic pain, industrial contraction, and political pressure on European governments. The European response has been to attempt to find alternative energy sources while maintaining sanctions on Russian energy imports. But the alternatives are insufficient, expensive, and slow to develop. Europe cannot replace Russian natural gas in any time frame that prevents severe economic damage. Russia's position is straightforward. We are willing to supply the energy you need, but sanctions architecture makes it difficult and expensive to process payments, arrange shipping, and secure insurance. Remove those obstacles and energy can flow. The grain agreement provides the template. Just as Russian Agricultural Bank was carved out of sanctions for humanitarian food security, Gazprom Bank can be carved out of sanctions for humanitarian energy security. Just as shipping insurance was authorized for grain vessels, it can be authorized for LNG tankers. Just as customs procedures were streamlined for fertilizer, they can be streamlined for oil and gas. The humanitarian framing is identical. European populations are suffering. Energy poverty is increasing. Industrial jobs are at risk. The humanitarian case for energy exemption is at least as strong as the humanitarian case for food exemption. European politicians who agreed to the grain deal have now established that humanitarian concerns override sanctions enforcement. They cannot coherently argue that food security justifies sanctions exemptions while energy security does not. The logical inconsistency is too stark. Russia is therefore positioned to negotiate similar carve-outs for energy exports over the coming months, using the grain agreement as precedent and template. Each carve-out further erodes the sanctions architecture and restores Russian trade revenue. But the cascade extends beyond energy. Consider the financial infrastructure dimension. Russian Agricultural Bank now has swift access for agricultural transactions. But how do you define which transactions are agricultural versus non-agricultural when a bank processes multiple transaction types? In practice, restoring swift access for specific transaction categories means restoring significant overall banking functionality. The technical complexity of segregating transaction types creates opportunities for expanded usage beyond the narrow exemption. This is not hypothetical. This is how sanctions erosion works in practice. Moreover, the precedent that major Russian banks can be reconnected to SWIFT when humanitarian concerns justify it means that other banks can be reconnected when other sufficient justifications are found. The principle of absolute financial isolation has been abandoned. Now, it is a question of what justifications are sufficient, and Russia has demonstrated that it can create crises that generate sufficient justifications. The shipping insurance provision has similar cascade potential. Western insurance companies now have explicit authorization to cover Russian cargo vessels for agricultural shipments. But insurance companies do not operate separate underwriting divisions for each cargo type. Restoring the commercial relationship for agricultural cargo creates pathways for expanded coverage. The practical effect is that the comprehensive sanctions architecture that was supposed to cripple Russian trade capacity is being systematically dismantled, one humanitarian exemption at a time. And each exemption was achieved through Russian-created crisis that generated international pressure for resolution. This is strategic judo. Use your opponent's humanitarian principles against them. Create crises that can only be resolved through sanctions relief. Frame each concession as a narrow humanitarian exemption while actually achieving systematic erosion of the entire sanctions framework. Let me also address the energy market dynamics specifically because this is where the strategic victory becomes most apparent. The European energy crisis was triggered by Russia reducing natural gas flows to Europe in response to sanctions. European leaders claimed this demonstrated that Russia was weaponizing energy and could not be trusted as a supplier. But the grain agreement undermines this narrative. If Russia was truly willing to starve millions of people by blocking Ukrainian grain and then agreed to allow grain shipments, it demonstrates that Russia responds to international pressure and diplomatic negotiations. It suggests that energy supplies could be restored through similar negotiations. European populations experiencing energy poverty and industrial shutdowns will now pressure their governments. You negotiated to get grain flowing, why can't you negotiate to get gas flowing? The political pressure for energy deal is enormous and growing. Russia knows this. Russia is waiting for European resolve to crack under economic pressure and political discontent. The grain agreement accelerates that cracking by demonstrating that Russia is willing to negotiate and that agreements can be reached. When European governments eventually negotiate energy agreements that further erode sanctions architecture, they will point to the grain agreement as precedent. They will frame it as humanitarian necessity, just like food security. And Russia will have achieved through patient strategic pressure what it could not achieve through military force: restoration of economic relationship with Europe on terms that preserve Russian revenue while fragmenting Western sanctions unity. Section 4, the global food security leverage and developing world alignment. Let me take you deeper into the geopolitical dimension of this agreement and explain how Russia used the grain crisis to fundamentally shift its relationship with the developing world in ways that provide enormous strategic advantage. Before this conflict, Russia's relationship with most developing nations was limited and transactional. Russia sold weapons and energy, but had little political or economic integration with the global South. These nations generally aligned with Western institutions and accepted American leadership of the international order. The grain crisis transformed this dynamic completely. Russia now positions itself as the champion of developing world food security against Western sanctions that were allegedly creating humanitarian catastrophe. Here is the narrative that Russia has been promoting across Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia. We are willing to feed the world. We have record grain harvest. We have the fertilizer that enables agricultural production globally. But Western sanctions are preventing these commodities from reaching the nations that need them. We tried to export grain and fertilizer, but Western financial systems blocked us. We want to help you feed your people, but the West is preventing us. This narrative is extraordinarily effective because it contains elements of truth. Western sanctions did create obstacles to Russian agricultural exports, even though food was theoretically exempted. Developing nations did face food security crises, partly because Russian fertilizer was not flowing efficiently due to sanctions complexity. Russia's framing positions the West as prioritizing geopolitical objectives over humanitarian concerns, while Russia claims to prioritize feeding hungry populations over political disputes. For developing nations facing actual food crises, this framing resonates powerfully. The grain agreement now allows Russia to claim validation of this narrative. See, we negotiated to ensure grain and fertilizer can flow. We made concessions to resolve the humanitarian crisis. We are reliable partners who care about food security. The West only agreed after months of pressure from nations facing starvation. Russia is using this to build political capital across the developing world. Every nation that Russia supplied with grain at subsidized prices during the crisis becomes politically aligned with Russia. Every nation that Russia provided fertilizer to becomes economically dependent on maintaining good relations with Russia. This represents a fundamental geopolitical shift. The developing world collectively represents approximately 70% of global population and an increasingly large share of global economic growth. If these nations shift from Western alignment toward neutrality or Russia alignment, it transforms the balance of power in international institutions. We are already seeing this in UN voting patterns. Resolutions condemning Russia receive far less support from developing nations than Western diplomats expected. Many nations abstain rather than support Western positions. Some actively oppose Western initiatives and support Russian positions. This shift is driven partly by historical resentment of Western colonialism and hypocrisy. But it is also driven by practical calculations about food security, energy access, and economic development. Nations that depend on Russian grain and fertilizer cannot afford to alienate Russia to please Western governments that are offering criticism but not concrete alternatives. The grain agreement accelerates this realignment by demonstrating that Russia is willing and able to provide commodities that developing nations need. It positions Russia as a solution provider rather than a problem creator. Let me give you specific examples of how this plays out strategically. Egypt depends on Russian and Ukrainian grain for 60% of its wheat supply. During the grain crisis, Russia offered to increase shipments to Egypt at subsidized prices. Egypt now views Russia as essential to its food security, regardless of what the United States wants Egypt to do geopolitically. Algeria, which faces political instability partly driven by food price inflation, received Russian grain and fertilizer on favorable terms during the crisis. Algeria now opposes Western sanctions and advocates for normalizing trade with Russia. Multiple African nations that faced acute food shortages received Russian agricultural assistance. These nations are now voting against Western positions in international forums and blocking attempts to isolate Russia diplomatically. This is strategic leverage accumulation on a massive scale. Russia is converting a temporary crisis into permanent political and economic relationships that restructure the international order. The West has no effective counter-strategy. Western food aid programs are smaller in scale than Russian commercial exports. Western agricultural producers sell at market prices while Russia offers subsidized political deals. Western governments are constrained by domestic political concerns about subsidizing foreign nations while Russia faces no such constraints.